Christopher Nolan has repeatedly pointed toward one particular line from Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey as an inspiration for his film. "Tell me about a complicated man." It's a line intended to introduce Odysseus as a figure with many different sides. A warrior, liar, husband, survivor, manipulator, and one of the most intelligent characters in Greek mythology. But now Emily Wilson has actually seen Christopher Nolan's version of that character, and according to her, he isn't particularly complicated at all. In a recent interview, Wilson described Nolan's Odysseus as a traumatized Jason Bourne, an action hero who feels guilty about being an action hero. She criticized the removal of his intelligence, disguised as humor, and many of the qualities that make him so memorable in Homer's poem. She also argued that Penelope's role had been reduced, that the movie failed to humanize many of the victims of Odysseus' violence, and that its moral messaging was ultimately incoherent. And since that interview, she has apparently become even harsher, describing the film's writing as abysmal and saying, "I would be ashamed to have written any part of this script." And that's a pretty significant criticism coming from the person whose translation helped inspire Nolan's interpretation of Odysseus in the first place. It's also important to know that Wilson isn't just another person online complaining that a costume looks strange or that a particular actor didn't match their preferred image of a mythological character. She is a professor of classical studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and her 2017 translation of the Odyssey became one of the most prominent modern English versions of Homer's poem. Of course, she took a different and divisive approach from some of her predecessors, but that's another topic altogether. And Nolan himself publicly cited her opening description of Odysseus as a complicated man when discussing what drew him toward the character. Now, to be clear, this does not mean Nolan simply adapted Wilson's translation line by line. His movie draws from several ancient traditions, including the Odyssey, the Iliad, the Aeneid, and the wider mythology surrounding the Trojan War. And that's actually one of the negatives about the film, in my opinion. But there is still some obvious irony here. The translator, whose work helped popularize the description of Odysseus as a complicated man, at least in more recent years, believes Nolan ultimately removed most of that complexity. And I say this as someone who actually enjoyed the film. I found it very entertaining, but also felt it was heavily lacking as an adaptation. Anyway, let's begin with Wilson's overall reaction. For starters, she didn't completely hate the experience. She called it a fun summer action movie, said her teenagers enjoyed it, and acknowledged that it was a major spectacle. She also celebrated the fact that the movie was bringing more attention to Homer and classical literature. She believes it succeeds as a large-scale Christopher Nolan action film. What she doubts is whether it succeeds as an adaptation of the qualities that make Homer's Odyssey particularly rich. And I completely agree with her on this. Her central criticism concerns Odysseus himself. Wilson famously translated the Greek word polytropos using the word complicated. It's a difficult word to reproduce perfectly in English. It can suggest someone of many turns, many ways, many strategies, or many different forms. It can describe the twisting route of Odysseus' journey, but it also describes the man. Homer's Odysseus constantly changes depending on who he is speaking to and what he needs. He disguises himself, invents false identities, manipulates enemies, tests allies, and tells elaborate stories about his own past. He can be charming, ruthless, intelligent, arrogant, affectionate, and deeply deceptive, sometimes within the same episode. But Wilson argues that Matt Damon's version loses most of this. Her fairly devastating assessment was that he resembles a traumatized Jason Bourne. And honestly, I can see what she means. Nolan's Odysseus is primarily defined through guilt over Troy. The Trojan horse becomes the central trauma around which his entire character is constructed. He created the plan that allowed the Greeks to enter the city, witness the destruction that followed, and then spends much of the movie haunted by what he helped unleash. This is all perfectly valid. It also connects Odysseus to the kinds of protagonists Nolan has explored before, men whose intelligence creates some enormous achievement, only for them to become tormented by its consequences. But that's not necessarily the defining version of Odysseus found in Homer. Homer's character certainly suffers, mourns, and experiences fear, but he is also entertaining. He enjoys telling stories. He lies even when telling the truth might be easier. And many of the poem's most famous scenes depend almost entirely on his ability to use language. The Cyclops encounter is the clearest example. In Homer, Odysseus doesn't just blind Polyphemus and escape. He tells the Cyclops that his name is Nobody, ensuring that when Polyphemus calls for help and announces that nobody is attacking him, the other Cyclopes misunderstand and leave. It's clever, darkly funny, and completely essential to Odysseus' characterization, but Nolan removes it. His Cyclops sequence is visually spectacular, and I still consider it one of the strongest parts of the movie, but Odysseus defeats the creature through a more direct and physical plan. The wordplay disappears, the other Cyclopes disappear, and so does one of the clearest demonstrations of why Odysseus is uniquely dangerous. Her take is that this great schemer becomes a soldier, a brooding man of action, and the complicated hero becomes a comparatively straightforward action hero who feels extremely guilty. Wilson describes this as an easy idealization narrative. Nolan removes or softens many of the qualities that might make modern audiences uncomfortable with Odysseus, then gives us a more recognizable heroic figure burdened by trauma. The obvious defense is that Homer's Odysseus might be difficult to place at the center of a modern blockbuster. This is a man who lies constantly, raids settlements, owns enslaved people, sleeps with other women, and returns home to participate in an extraordinarily violent massacre. But Wilson rejects the idea that modern audiences are incapable of accepting that ambiguity. Modern film and television are filled with morally complicated protagonists. Audiences have spent years watching characters like Walter White and Tony Soprano damage nearly everyone around them while remaining completely fascinated by them. And Matt Damon has already demonstrated that he can play this kind of character. His performance in The Talented Mr. Ripley required him to be charming, deceptive, adaptable, and deeply unsettling, the exact combination of qualities that could have produced a fascinating Odysseus. Wilson even says that Damon's history as Ripley initially gave her hope, but that was not the version Nolan chose. And to be clear, I still thought Damon was good, but a good performance isn't necessarily the same thing as a faithful interpretation. Wilson's next criticism concerns the people around Odysseus. She argues that the film is so concentrated on his guilt that almost everyone else begins to feel like a tool supporting his emotional journey. The Trojans wear masks, making them visually anonymous. Odysseus is haunted by what he did at Troy, but we rarely experience Troy through the people who actually suffered because of his plan. We are asked to pity the warrior after the violence without spending nearly as much time with the victims of that violence. Wilson considered Zendaya's character, who appears to blend Athena with the memory of a Trojan woman, one of the film's more effective reinventions, because she gives Odysseus' conscience a human face, but even she ultimately exists largely to guide him back toward Ithaca. Personally, I was not a huge fan of anything to do with Zendaya's role. Wilson contrasts this with Homer, where even enemies and monsters are sometimes granted a degree of humanity. Polyphemus is a cannibalistic giant who eats Odysseus' men, but Homer still gives him affection for his animals. After being blinded, he speaks tenderly to his favorite ram, unaware that Odysseus is hiding beneath it. Nolan's Polyphemus is visually much more frightening, but almost entirely monstrous. As Wilson puts it, the movie turns nearly everyone who is not Matt Damon into something resembling a puppet. The same problem affects Penelope. In Homer, Penelope is not simply the prize waiting at the end of the journey. She is fighting her own version of Odysseus' battle. She deceives the suitors by weaving and secretly undoing Laertes' funeral shroud. She controls information carefully. She tests the disguised Odysseus, and when he finally reveals himself, she doesn't immediately accept his claim. She tests him with the secret of their marriage bed. Only Odysseus knows that the bed cannot be moved because he constructed it around a living olive tree, and his reaction provides the proof she needs. Wilson's take is that the recognition works because they are intellectual equals, stating that both survive through patience, secrecy, testing, and deception. Wilson also believes Nolan reduces Penelope so significantly that the film undermines the marriage at the center of the entire journey. She questions why the audience should care whether this particular man returns to this particular wife when their relationship has not been developed enough to make the reunion fully convincing. To be clear, I do not think the marriage completely failed in the movie. Anne Hathaway has some effective moments, and the idea that Penelope is the reason Odysseus keeps moving is clear enough. But I agree that the relationship is more asserted than demonstrated. The film repeatedly tells us that Odysseus needs to return to his wife, where Homer shows us why these two people might uniquely belong together. Wilson also criticized the removal of the gods. Zeus and Poseidon do not appear on screen, while Athena's role is heavily reinterpreted. This is a massive change because Homer's Odyssey begins with the gods discussing Odysseus' fate, and divine action shapes almost every stage of his return. Poseidon persecutes him, Athena protects and disguises him, Hermes helps him survive Circe, and later carries Zeus's command to Calypso. By reducing the gods, Nolan creates a more grounded world where Odysseus appears responsible for his own choices and consequences, but he also removes the poem's cosmic structure. In Homer, the journey is not merely about a traumatized veteran overcoming physical obstacles. It's also about the relationship between human choice, fate, divine favor, and the unpredictable will of the gods. Wilson described the movie's moral messaging as incoherent, particularly because it appears to condemn warfare while also condemning cowardice. The film also wants Odysseus to reject the warrior culture that destroyed Troy, while still giving him a heroic final massacre in Ithaca. It wants him to feel guilty about killing, while presenting more killing as the act that restores his family. That tension exists in Homer too, but Nolan seems to want a cleaner anti-war message without surrendering the audience's satisfaction in watching Odysseus destroy the villains. On a brighter note, Wilson was more positive about the movie's structure. She praised Nolan's use of stories within stories, memories inside conversations, and flashbacks that temporarily swallow the present-day narrative. That braided storytelling is deeply Homeric. Much of the Odyssey consists of characters recounting events, repeating stories they heard from other people, or presenting carefully manipulated versions of their own lives. And Nolan, who has spent his career making films about time, memory, and unreliable perspective, seemed like an obvious director for that material. Wilson said she once viewed him as potentially ideal for the Odyssey for precisely this reason. She was also clear that Nolan had every right to reinvent the story. Her criticism is not that every deviation from Homer is automatically wrong. The Odyssey has been reinterpreted for thousands of years, and no 3-hour film could include every episode or preserve every contradiction in the poem. Her problem is that the changes frequently make the material less interesting rather than differently interesting, and this is where her later comments become much harsher. Her initial reaction was critical but balanced. She called the film entertaining, praised the spectacle, and acknowledged the effectiveness of some of Nolan's narrative ideas. But she later described the film's combination of grandiosity and superficiality, argued that the characters were too underdeveloped to support its larger ideas, and said, "I would be ashamed to have written any part of this script." She then put it even more bluntly: the writing is abysmal, and that's a rejection of the screenplay at its most fundamental level. Wilson believes Nolan's film lacks the psychological, emotional, and ethical depth of Homer. She doesn't think the characters possess convincing enough motivations, and she doesn't believe its treatment of war, guilt, memory, or history delivers on the ideas the movie appears to promise. And I absolutely agree that the movie frequently simplifies the character Nolan claimed to find so fascinating. Christopher Nolan's Odyssey is primarily about one man trying to live with what he has done. Homer's Odyssey is a man of many forms attempting to return to a world filled with other people whose lives, identities, and loyalties are almost as unstable as his own. And while Nolan gives us a traumatized warrior, Homer gives us a liar, strategist, survivor, husband, king, raider, storyteller, and killer, sometimes admirable, sometimes horrifying, and often impossible to reduce to a single moral judgment. A genuinely complicated man. Anyway, that's it for today's video. Let me know what all of you think down in the comment section below. And as always, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next one.